Did that work? Yep. Okay. Okay. Yeah, it is a different sound system. Okay. Well, good morning. And before we get started, I would like to thank Marshall for hosting, and especially Scott. Scott really has done a great job hosting because it's being a NASA center, he wasn't able to host it on center. So doing this remote work really has been a challenge for him. And he's really risen to it. I think yesterday went great. So we give Scott and Marshall a round of applause. Okay, and well, I'm very excited for this morning's keynote speaker because I've been a regular reader of the Rocket Report. I don't know if people are aware of that. But we're very privileged to have Mr. Eric Berger as our keynote speaker today. Eric is the senior space editor at Ars Technica, covering everything from astronomy to private space to wonky NASA policy. Eric has an astronomy degree from the University of Texas and a master's in journalism from the University of Missouri. He previously worked at the Houston Chronicle for 17 years, where the paper was a Pulitzer Prize finalist in 2009 for his coverage of Hurricane Ike. He's a certified meteorologist, and he founded Space City Weather, and he lives in Houston. And as I've been talking to him, he just wants to see cool things happen in space. So if this is not the crowd that also has that same goal, this will be great. I'm very looking forward to it. Please welcome Eric Berger.
This one? Yep. Okay, well, good morning. I was pleasantly surprised to be invited here to talk about space policy, and the part of my bio that applies is wonky space policy this morning. But it's an time. This last 6 months has been pretty fascinating to watch the administration change NASA a little bit and sort of get it, moving toward the moon, with some success and I think probably with some failure as well. But I say it was a little. Managers don't. Back in the 1980s, I was a whiz kid at using the basic computer language. Wrote some pretty amazing choose-your-own-adventures on my Apple II GS. And you may have heard about me in the 1990s. I was a self-taught master when it came to HTML. So I got to Missouri in 1995, and I coded. And it remains something of a masterpiece today. It's still there on the Internet Wayback Machine. I couldn't believe it when I found it this weekend. So you may be wondering, Eric, what are your top 10 Guns N' Roses songs? So for your edification, here they are. So, looking back 25 years, not a bad list, actually. I'll take it. So, it's interesting how you sort of change in life. So, since that time, pretty much the sum total of my programming experience has been occasionally clicking the text rather than the visual editor in WordPress. So, yeah, I know nothing about flight software. Basically was the point of that introduction. I do know this. It was a lesson imparted to me by Wayne Hale, former Space Shuttle program manager. He lives in Houston. He and I talk pretty frequently, and we were talking at one point. I'm not sure what the context was, but I said, Wayne, why does it take so long to write flight software? You'd think, like, the hard part would be building the rocket.
In the middle.
Pretty naive, I know. Probably telling the wrong audience that, my thoughts there. But he told me that, look, flight software is very hard, and it's always put off in favor of the hardware development. So they build the rocket, and then everyone's like, oh, well, we figure out the flight software. And so there's this mad scramble to get everything done at the end. So in some sense, we are kindred spirits, because flight software sounds a lot. It was a mad scramble to get everything done right before a deadline. So before jumping into space policy, I wanted to tell you one other aerospace-related programming story. This is a picture of, well, who knows what that's a picture of? Yeah, it's Falcon 1 rocket launching from Omelek. This is the second flight of the Falcon 1 rocket. So back in 2007. And the programming part of the story was told to me by Hans Koenigsmann, who for a long time was head of avionics at SpaceX. So the first launch, of course, did not get much higher than this. It got here, the engine was on fire, and it fell back into the lagoon. The second launch got quite a bit. So they weren't sure about the second stage, and they had concerns about sort of the fuel slosh in the second stage, and sort of should they put baffles in, should they put baffles in. If they'd put baffles in, it wasn't really a money consideration, but it would have taken more than a mass consideration. They were already pushing the limits of their rocket and its capabilities with the Merlin 1A engine. So Hans said that he had someone model it, the slosh with the current design of the stage, and he said 6 to 7 computer models. 7th model showed a problem. So he went and he talked to Elon about it, and basically they decided that they didn't want to take a couple more months and sort of really dig deep into why that simulation was showing a problem. And when they got to their pre-flight meeting, they had their top 10 lists of concern about propulsion, top 10 concerns on structures, top 10 concerns on avionics, and slosh in the second stage was number 11 on their list of concerns. So it didn't even that meeting. Of course, the rocket takes off, it makes it into space, second stage firing, and then it starts oscillating, and it basically goes out of control, and they lose the rocket orbit. So now at the SpaceX meetings where they do things, they don't do the top 10 concerns for each section before launch, they do the top 11. So as Elon told me, they go to 11. While I don't know much about flight software, I do know some things about space policy, and I want to talk to you today about the big news of the year, which is NASA's push for the Artemis program. And I want to talk about how we got here and where I think we may be going, which is hopefully the moon, right? But we'll see. So here is a rendition of a ascent vehicle taking back off from a descent vehicle on the moon. We're not sure what vehicle that is because the contractors have not been chosen yet, of course, for the lander. But to really understand where we're going, I think we need to understand the past. And specifically, I want to talk just for a minute why Apollo worked and contrast. And more than that, why did this, think about it in the 60s, going to the moon, pretty big deal. It came in under schedule, right? The deadline was the end of the decade. So that means what? December 1969, and they made it in July. It's pretty remarkable if you think about big aerospace programs today, both in the private sector and in NASA. Okay, so with that, last March, the vice president came to this very city and gave a rousing speech. And he talked about, this was now the stated policy of this administration to return American astronauts 5 years. If we take that literally, he means March of 2024, but we'll give him to the end of 2024. And this president, this administration, the American people are committed to achieving that goal. Now, I thought it was issues with NASA and talked about we ought to be able to do, but when you heard that speech or read about it or read the speech online, did you believe NASA would get humans to the moon by 2024? Right? I mean, I wanted to believe it because I'd love to see that my lifetime, but I think we were all deeply skeptical, and I think that skepticism was pretty hard won. If y'all want to sit down, come down, walk down the, you know, I go to meetings as a journalist, and I'm always walking in and out. So, you know, please. First, let's understand why a successful. If you think about it, know how to get to the moon. In fact, when Kennedy gave his speech, not the one at Rice University, the 1961, before, still had not even put someone into orbit, okay? A 15-minute suborbital flight, and going to the moon. So I asked Chris Kraft once about this, and he told me he was in Florida running a simulation. He was the first flight director for the agency, and he said he just about fell out of his chair when he heard Kennedy's speech, because he thought that was crazy, right? Because there was so much they didn't know, right? They didn't even know what the lunar surface was like. Yeah, so they didn't have the technical skills. They had a lot to learn, and they had a lot to do. But they did it, right? And that's because the agency had some political advantages that were really quite potent. First of all, the Kennedy White House engaged Congress in a partnership from the get-go. He gave his first speech before a joint session of Congress. And look at the way he speaks to Congress, right? So there he is. You know, this is the judgment that the member of Congress must finally make. Let it be clear, I am asking Congress and the country to accept a firm commitment to a new course of action. This is great. A course which will last for many years and carry very heavy costs. Okay? It's true. It was going to take a long time, and it was going to cost a lot of money, and he had to ask Congress for the money to do it. Secondly, which is amazing, is that Kennedy gave them exact numbers. He said he needed $531 million in fiscal year 1962 and estimated that it would be $7 to $9 billion over the next 5 years. That's almost $80 billion in present-day money, and that was fairly close to the mark. A remarkable, you know, honesty in politics. It was, you know, it's refreshing to kind of look back and see that. He had arrived at this number because he asked the NASA administrator, James Webb, to realistically estimate the budget. So Webb did that. He went to his people and said, how much do you think it's going to cost to get us to the moon? And then Webb doubled that number, and then told the White House and Congress to not do this unless they were willing to spend that much money. So that's pretty cool. Yeah, so Kennedy was pretty clear about this. You know, he echoed Webb's comments. He said, if we are only going to go halfway or reduce our sights in the face of difficulty, in my judgment, it would be better not to go at all. I can agree with that. And Kennedy also gave Congress a very clear sense of purpose. Why should the U.S. spend all of this money, $80 billion in our money, over the next 5 years? He said, because after Sputnik, the Russians were making a claim to global technological superiority. You know, it was an interesting time, right, in 1961. You know, they'd been, you know, several years since Sputnik, and sort of, you know, Americans didn't quite know everything that was going over their heads in the sky, you know. And if you look back at the polling from that time, it's really interesting. So Gallup polling in 1960 showed that large majorities of people in countries like Great Britain, France, West Germany, India, these are our allies, believed that the Soviet Union would lead the world in science during the 1960s. So, yeah, right? So NASA got the funding. Congress stepped up. At one point, NASA's budget was 10% of the DoD budget. So if NASA were to get 10% of the DoD budget today, be $70 billion, right? And we could have this in a palace, right? You know, we could have, it would be great. Okay. So that was how Kennedy did it, which set the stage for success. And I'm not here to bag on the Trump administration. I have conferred with them on a number of reasons. I think in space policy, they've been pretty reasonable about a lot of things. But, so Kennedy went to Congress and said, I need your help. Did Trump address Congress? No. He didn't appeal to Congress. He sent Mike Pence to give the speech. Maybe a good decision, but Pence didn't speak to Congress. He came to NASA Marshall Space Flight Center and said, we're doing this. This is the policy of this administration. You know, nothing about Congress in that speech. And probably the biggest problem is, whereas Kennedy clearly discussed costs and said this is going to be a heavy burden, there's no mention of costs in Pence's speech. In fact, they refused to put a price tag on the Artemis program, saying that a full accounting would come in the president's fiscal year 2021 budget. So that's like February of next year. So, you know, how much is it going to cost? How much is it going to cost? So in April, I reported that, according to two people I talked to in the agency, that basically NASA had told the White House to do this by 2024. It was $6 to $8 billion a year, in addition to the existing budget. So that's the, you know, you'd be plussing up the exploration budget by that much. A couple weeks later, Bridenstine told the Senate, NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine told the Senate Appropriations Committee about that, because he was asked about this. He said it would be nowhere close to that amount. Thanks, Jim. I actually like Jim. It seems to me he really cares about NASA, and he's trying to be administrator for the entire agency. And his heart seems to be in the right place in terms of trying to genuinely advance spaceflight. You can't say that of all the current federal agency directors, I don't think. Okay. So in June, Bridenstine gave a CNN interview where he was asked again about the cost of Artemis, and he said it would be $4 to $6 billion a year. All I'm going to say is that the top end of the low end of my estimate, $6 billion, and the top end of his estimate are the same number. But there's been this song and dance about, you know, costs, and so we're going to be in a situation where we go a full year from when the program is announced. So it was announced in March by Pence, to it being, the cost maybe being revealed next February with the 2021 budget rollout. But let's be honest, it's going to be at least $30 billion. And given how programs go, you know, James Webb knew enough to double the number. $30 billion is probably a very conservative estimate. But this sort of obfuscation about cost. So, you know, Congress is out there and they're like, okay, you want us to pay for this big, expensive new program. You won't tell us how much it's going to cost. I mean, even if you're an ardent supporter of Artemis, it's not hard to understand the justification of not wanting to start a program without sort of a clear idea of what it's going to cost you when you control the budget. All right, so what about the clear sense of purpose? You know, Pence went back to the Apollo playbook. If you go back and look at his speech announcing the goal, he said, last December, China became the first nation to land on the far side of the moon and revealed their ambition to seize the lunar strategic high ground and become the world's preeminent spacefaring nation. Pence then said, you know, we refuse to accept a future written in space written by the enemies of freedom. Okay, that's clear, saying we're in a new space race. This is about American dominance in space. The moon looks like it's where the action is going to be over the next 10 to 20 years. We need to beat China back there. We need to see, you know, understand if it has resources. And this is something we can and should do. Okay, that's pretty clear, right? You know, there's some people at headquarters, the quote-unquote Mars Mafia, who didn't like that, but it was a defensible plan. Then the president starts to muddy the waters. He's done it in a number of campaign speeches, but probably most prominently he did it on the day before the 50th anniversary of the Apollo moon landing, he had a photo op with Buzz Aldrin, Mike Collins, and then the sons of Neil Armstrong. Had him in the Oval Office. And then, so they're behind him, and Trump's sitting at the desk, and then Bridenstine is kind of off to the side. If you watched it, I give Jim handled himself pretty well. So, but basically, he proceeds to grill Bridenstine about his own space policy, right? Space Policy Directive #1, which he'd signed, and then later, he turns around to Mike Collins and says, you know, what do you think about this Mars Direct concept, right? And Collins, who has written about it and is a fan of it, saying, you know, we've been to the moon, let's go to Mars, and let's not mess around with the moon, let's go straight to Mars, sort of says that in Michael Collins' eloquent way, and Trump replies, well, who knows better than these people? They've been doing this stuff for a long time. And he turns to Bridenstine and says, what about the concept of Mars Direct? And Bridenstine sort of, again, talks about how, well, we need to go to the moon to learn the skills to go to Mars. Trump is clearly interested in Mars, and he doesn't seem excited about the return of the moon. He kind of shares the same attitude that President Obama had toward the moon, which was, been there, done that, right? The moon was not a good word during the Obama administration. Anyway, so as the president has made clear in tweets, campaign speeches, and in the Oval Office, you know, he says, okay, well, if you got to go to the moon, you got to go to the moon, but let's get the hell out of there as soon as we can. And so you started to see NASA talk more about the moon as a proving ground for Mars, right? We're not going to the moon's sake. We're going to the moon because it's a stepping stone. In fact, earlier this month, the agency's deputy administrator, Jim Morehard, gave a talk where he said the primary goal of Artemis is to serve as a Mars concept of operations, an end-to-end demonstration of technologies and capabilities needed for human missions to the Red Planet. So, Artemis, oh, sorry, I should have showed that earlier. This is the, this is scene. I think this is where Trump was actually, like, asking, like, the astronauts about their family members or something like that, and Buzz was not there with a family member. And so he sort of says, who's this? And Buzz is like, ah. It's pretty funny. You should go back and watch it because it's kind of funny. So yeah, that was the Apollo celebration. Anyway, there's Artemis and Apollo. Artemis, of course, is the twin sister of Apollo. I think it's a great name for the moon program, even if we've used Artemis for other program names. But I mean, let's face it, if really about going to Mars, maybe we should name it Eris, after the sister of Ares. I had to look that up, E-R-I-S, Eris. I don't know anything about Greek mythology either, but fortunately I know how to use the internet. But that's enough about, I guess, mythology. Okay, so whenever the White House directs NASA, you know, to set up a program to send humans back to the moon or go to Mars or elsewhere, one of the very first things that the agency does is pull together advisory panels to provide messaging advice, right? Why is this? Because if you're going to go somewhere and spend a lot of money, you've got to tell the public why you're doing it, right? So why are we going back to the moon? Why do we need to go to Mars? How can NASA ultimately justify tens or more likely hundreds of billions of dollars? You know, the fact of the matter is, especially for Mars, there is little or no economic justification, right? By going to Mars, NASA will not generate new wealth for the United States. There just aren't resources there that we can bring back. There's all kinds of other benefits, as we saw during Apollo, in terms of education and inspiration, that kind of thing. But, you know, we're not going to Mars to bring back, you know, rare earth metals, and we're not going to put solar panels on Mars to provide power on Earth, and we're not going to put factories on Mars to ship all that stuff back to Earth. And it's really hard to talk about, like, the value of exploration. Like, that was the journey to Mars, was kind of the justification that we were going to go find life or evidence of past life on Mars. And humans can explore with more dexterity than robots, certainly. But it really, that hardly justifies a 100-fold cost increase or the big safety risks in sending people instead of machines. So this leaves NASA with fuzzy explanations, often along the lines of it's human nature to explore and expand our horizons, it's our destiny. And frankly, the American public has been unmoved by these appeals. So this is, I'm sorry, this doesn't look great. But this is one of several recent surveys that was done about the U.S. space program should monitor, or this basically said, what should the U.S., NASA is, I'll speak eventually. This, of the following things, they are very or extremely important to Americans that NASA should be doing these things. Okay, so they don't want NASA to do military, good, because it's a civil space agency. You know, send astronauts to Mars, 27, return astronauts to the moon, 23%. So basically a quarter of the public thinks it's very or extremely important that NASA be doing the human exploration stuff that we're talking about. Survey after survey after survey shows they want them to find asteroids that could threaten the Earth. They want to understand the planet and the solar system. They want to know what's happening on our planet and if there's anything that's coming that's going to destroy our planet. They're much less concerned about exploration, although that's, you know, half of the agency's budget. Okay, so that's the public opinion. There's not this huge groundswell out there to go do this right now and spend a lot of money. And the hard reality is that, you know, really since the Cold War, the exploration of deep space has not been part of the strategic national interest. Now, maybe that's changing, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But, you know, NASA's already sent humans to the moon. So, like, just sending more people to the moon, the first woman and the next man, does that, you know, does that really change the discussion about sort of the United States being viewed as a global science superpower? I'm not sure it does. And, you know, the crazy thing is, like, the moon, as hard as it is the low-hanging fruit, right? There's nowhere else for humans to reasonably go in deep space and land that is as easy is the wrong word, but is sort of as straightforward as that. You know, when you think about the difference between moon and Mars, you know, you've got to pre-supply the planet with, you know, you got to pre-supply it. You got to survive the radiation environment there, on the surface and on the way back. You've got to provide surface power. You've got to launch from the Martian surface, something we've never even done with a robot. And then you've got to safely land on Earth, coming in with higher energies. It's an order of magnitude greater challenge. And as Don Pettit said once to me, if the toilet breaks in the International Space Station, NASA sends a replacement up. If the toilet breaks on the way to Mars, the crew dies. That's Don Pettit, by the way. Nice guy, brilliant engineer, now actually NASA's oldest astronaut. I believe he's 64. So, you know, in thinking about a deep space exploration program, NASA's kind of stuck between Scylla and Charybdis. The choice to return to the moon is generally the attitude from the public, from the last two presidents, has been there, done that. And I think that's representative of a lot of Americans. You have a hard time selling them on why we're doing this. And while Mars is probably more sexy to people, and it would certainly make a bigger geopolitical statement, it's a multi-decade, enormously expensive program. And the justification of science is really pretty weak because robots can do a lot of what humans can do. So, because of all that, for the last 30 years, presidential administrations have kind of bounced around. Like, it's been the moon, it's been Mars. Clinton was the only president who actually didn't have a sort of a moon or Mars program. So I said all that to sort of talk about the big problem today I see with Artemis. And that's that after Apollo, the aerospace community has been hampered by a great fracturing of desires. So there's no unity of purpose among the stakeholders today. And this is what I want you to take away from this speech today, of why it is so hard to get everybody on the same page and why it seems like we never really go very far. So we already talked about the fact that the White House sets space policy, but they don't control the purse strings. You know, they've got to get congressional consent. So you've got the White House, you know. So we're going to talk about the competing factions of space policy, and the first one is the White House. They appoint the NASA administrator, and they set space policy. They can have a National Space Council or not. They do it under the Trump presidency. Vice President Mike Pence is very involved in this, and so this is a hands-on White House when it comes to space policy. But Congress is the major impediment, right? It generally has parochial priorities. Individual members want to stack funding and jobs into the NASA's field centers and contractor hubs in their local districts and states. Your House of Representatives person generally is not looking out for the greater good of NASA. He or she is looking out for the greater good of his or her reelection. And that's just how it is. In the Senate, there's a little bit more vision, I would say, but not a whole lot. You know, I'll be careful what I say, but, you know, 'cause I'm in Alabama, but the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, Alabama Republican Richard Shelby, has absolute control over the agency's budget in the Senate. And as a result, you know, most of the major aerospace companies have expanded or opened offices or factories in Alabama. There's a traffic jam on the freeway when I drove in this morning. I mean, clearly this area is booming. You know, and it's not just ULA. In Decatur, Blue Origin put its big BE-4 rocket engine factory here. Aerojet is expanding. And Shelby prioritizes funding for NASA programs that are based right here at Marshall Space Flight Center. Some of us joke darkly that NASA now stands for the North Alabama Space Administration. But as powerful as Shelby is in the Senate, you know, there's other players as well. There's the field centers, okay? This in the parlance of the White House might be the deep state, right? So you've got NASA headquarters and the field centers, and they're always looking to consolidate power. You know, even back during Apollo, Johnson Space Center in Houston and Marshall here in Alabama had a rivalry. Wernher von Braun and Robert Gilruth worked together, but they weren't friends. They battled for resources all the time. That battle is ongoing, right? You fight to get a budget for something in that program, and you never want to give it up because it means you have to cut people or whatever. And like the rivalry between Houston and Marshall, or JSC and Marshall, was exacerbated after Challenger because each of the centers blamed the other for that accident. And so while the centers want to make progress, not dogging people or administrators at various field centers because they work hard, they want to make progress, but they don't want to cede power to other centers to make that progress. And that's just how bureaucracy works. And then there are the large aerospace contractors who are also jealous of their funding, their businesses, right? So after the space shuttle program ended in 2011, the major players went along with that because they all got a piece of the action going forward. Boeing had the shuttle orbiter. Now they have the core stage of the SLS rocket. Orbital ATK had the SRBs, solid rocket boosters. They'd build them for the SLS. Aerojet's going to continue making space shuttle engines, and Lockheed built the external fuel tank for the shuttle, and now they're building Orion. So, like, they are a major constituency to be reckoned with when it comes to space policy. And then finally, there's another community with increasing influence. This is the new space companies, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and a bunch of other people sort of talking about, hey, we can take public funding, combine it with private investment, and do things faster and cheaper and maybe even better. And so they're battling. You know, there's all this talk about it's not us and them. It's we. That's bullshit. It's us versus them. And some of the companies like Blue Origin are playing nicer than others with the older aerospace companies, but those rivalries are very real, and those battles are occurring all the time. Okay, and this is even a simplistic view, right? Because Congress is not a monolith. The Democrats have the House, the Republicans have the Senate, and so there's a split there. And in the White House, I can count at least 3 different camps on space policy in the White House when it comes to Artemis. So there's the Vice President, the National Space Council, which are very clear. We want to go to the moon by 2024, do lunar surface operations. We want to think clearly about what civil and military space means. You know, so they've put some thought into that. Then there is the Oval Office itself. The President has made it clear he has 2 priorities in space: Mars and Space Force. Come on. You know, and this is only going to confuse the hell out of people more because they're going to see, you know, the Space Force show on Netflix, and it's going to involve NASA, and it's a military thing, and so that I shudder to think about sort of the public understanding of civil and military space. Okay, but it's not just the President. Then there's OMB, which also plays a powerful role, and they don't want to pay for any of this stuff, right? They're against surface missions anywhere. they don't like the Lunar Gateway, and presumably they'd like to use NASA to use as much cheap commercial stuff as possible. So like, it's a mess, right? The bottom line is there's lots of different pressure points on space policy, and they're all kind of pushing and pulling it in directions that favor them. The end result of this is that no one can ever really agree where to go, how to go, or how to pay for it, which are three things you have to decide. So let's take just one quick example of this. The centerpiece of the White House budget is the lunar lander. It has asked for an extra $1 billion in this fiscal year 2020 to get this moving, and it will need obviously a lot more in 2020. So who supports it? Trump? Yeah, probably. Pence? Absolutely. OMB? No. Senate? Nah, they gave $700 million out of the billion asked for. The House has provided no funding. And industry's kind of gone along with it because NASA has said we're going to fund we'd like to fund two different landers. So if you've got 2 or 3 companies on one team and 3 or 4 companies on another team, you're bringing along lots of new space and old space. And if you look at the Blue Origin lander plan, it was brilliantly conceived, in my opinion, because you had a mix of both companies, both types of companies on there. So industry, I think you could say they support the lunar lander, probably, more or less. So like, that's what, three yeses, 2 no's, and 1 kind of maybe. So, you know, maybe that's going to be enough funding to get, or money to get some, or enough support to get some funding for the program in fiscal year 2020. But, you know, you all know you're on a continuing resolution through December 20th. And after that, you know, who knows? Like maybe they'll come, maybe they'll come together and sing Kumbaya. They'll figure out the border wall funding issue. They'll figure out the impeachment issue, and we'll get a budget. I think probably more likely is that we'll see continuing resolutions, and there is no money in the lander in a continuing resolution. So these contracts that NASA had originally wanted to award for landers in December, you know, are going to slip until January at least, and then further. And so, I mean, if you're holding out any hope for 2024, that was gone a long time ago. You know, wildly optimistically, I think would be 2026 for the landing. You know, and we haven't even talked about sort of the political football that funding has become. You know, the White House came out of the gate saying that, well, we just need $1.6 billion this year, and we're going to get it from the Pell Grant surplus. And while technically of that are horrible, and it gave Democrats a ready-made excuse to say, look, we're not taking funding away from educating low-income people. That's ridiculous to support a 2024 date that seems to be political. So, you know, getting to the end of my my time here, so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. I think it's safe to say, well, I was going to talk about the vision for space exploration. We'll skip that. I think it's safe to say that this has not been a super optimistic talk. Sorry about that, but the world of space policy is what it is. There are a couple reasons for optimism. One is I think that the administrator and the vice president have a pretty good grasp on these issues. I've been impressed with Jim Bridenstine's knowledge of sort of the reasons why things are the way they are and the challenges. I'm not convinced he has the power to change a whole lot of that. He is kind of a small corner of the White House, right? He's up here, and that's it. And he has some control here at NASA HQ, but he's very little power in Congress and the companies. So, you know, we got an administrator who kind of understands the problems. There are some forcing functions coming from private space. Reusable rockets are a thing now. It remains to be seen whether they completely shatter the economic paradigm of launch. SpaceX has not reduced its prices for reusable rockets. I think that's probably because they don't have to. They're already the lowest cost provider. But you know, there's good momentum there from the commercial space sector to provide solutions that address the cost of access to space, which is a huge issue. The second factor is that for the first time in decades, NASA and the United States have a major rival in outer space, is China. And the Asian country, they view space very much the way Kennedy did in the 1960s as a means of demonstrating technological capability. and sort of putting themselves on equal footing as the United States. And for them, that includes sending taikonauts to the lunar surface. And this is the path China is on. If not the 2030s, then probably the early 2030s, I think. They're already starting to, and you can see it, they're starting to peel off NASA's traditional partners in Europe to build a space station. And, ESA astronauts are going to China to learn Chinese and train alongside their counterparts. And China's talking to these partners about deep space missions and doing deep space missions, and they're talking about sort of going to the moon with them. So, and this is the very cool panorama from the Chang'e spacecraft that landed on the far side of the moon. That was China's first really big space first, but I think we'll see more of them. So yeah, I guess I would just close by saying that there is an opportunity for change here. Artemis may be the catalyst for that. It may not. But, we better get serious about this because, we've had several decades where we've kind of had the playing field to ourselves and Russia to a lesser extent. But that is clearly changing. The long talk I gave about sort of the history of space policy suggests that things won't change. But I write about this stuff because I'm hopeful that it will. So thank you.
So questions? Oh.
So I find it interesting how you started this presentation, where you start talking about the Apollo 11 moon landing and the Kennedy administration's heavy persistence on this. Do you think that a lot of the blowback we're seeing from the American public is that of complacency, where we see Apollo 11, we're like, you said we did that. We did the moon. Why would we want to do it again? Or why would we even want to do Mars? Because we've been to space. I'm a huge Star Trek fan, so I always look at the sky and I'm like, well, what's past Mars? What's past Jupiter? What's past Planet X? What's past the Oort cloud? And the matter of complacency in the NASA administration's schedule and how that plays in with the big industry. And I kind of wanted a little bit more elaboration on that, because you kind of just touched, here's Apollo 11, here's Kennedy, here's Artemis, here's Mike Pence, and how that interplay happens. Could you elaborate more on the impact of that complacency as it pertains to not just future missions, but with Artemis, and how do we remedy that from an administrative level, in your mind?
So I think there is definitely a public complacency, that been there, done that attitude that both President Obama and President Trump seem to espouse. I think is generally reflective of the fact that that the American public is not clamoring for this. And so I think there are two ways to address that. One, you either come up with a really compelling reason, like China releases a plan, they're going to land taikonauts there on 2028, and they're either going to be waiting for us or we're going to be waiting for them. I think that is a pretty compelling rationale. Or, if we do some of these probes to the lunar poles and they find oceans of water beneath the surface, which is unlikely, I think that's a compelling reason. The other thing I think that would be powerful is to stop so much talking about the stuff that you want to do, but actually do it, right? So what was a super powerful thing that NASA did a couple of years ago? It flew by Pluto, right? That captured the public's attention, because that wasn't the administrator out there saying, in 5 years, we're going to fly by Pluto. That was, hey, we just flew by Pluto and look at these awesome pictures. Or, SpaceX doesn't so much, well, Elon talks about, been talking about the Falcon Heavy since 2014, but they or earlier than that even, but they launched it. So doing stuff is much more grabs people's attention as opposed to talking about doing stuff. So, but there's a chicken and the egg, because you can't do the stuff until you get the funding for it. But I don't know. I think as a journalist, I just see a lot of sort of promotion and talk, and then it usually doesn't happen. I think just the public is much more moved by action rather than words.
So I guess as a follow-up note, like you don't get fired for not doing anything, right? But if you keep everything the same, then you just dirtle along and end your administration versus taking those big risks. I mean, what if the Challenger did succeed? We start not thinking about that as much as like looking at it as a catastrophic failure, which it was, but less about what do we do in the future, but rather that knee-jerk reaction of like, well, we want to be really careful with people in space. It's like, yeah, I get that, but as a means to show a very solid plan of how to correct the error rather than just dirtling. So
Well, I mean, they had a big commission. You know, they commissioned after those accidents, and they tried to address some of the problems. Part of the issue with NASA is that it's hamstrung by the fact that it is a big bureaucracy. It has civil service protections, which are important, but also serve to. I mean, you're not going to, if you're in the bottom 10% of the production, you're not going to be fired, right? In private industry, that's not the case. And it's very difficult for NASA to compete. And one of the things that's frustrating for me is I see NASA trying to compete with areas like launch where the private sector is successful, whereas there's other things that NASA could be doing that the private industry has no interest in doing.
Thank you. Other questions?
I'm curious. Your talk was focused mostly on lander, and Gateway to me is much more exciting and interesting, and a space that's not been really presented, I think, well by the administration. I'd like to hear your thoughts on Gateway.
Yeah, so the Lunar Gateway is interesting, right? Because I think that the reason that Bill Gerstenmaier, the associate administrator, was so strong on Gateway is that he saw that as entirely a doable project. Like from administration to administration, Gateway could survive either if it was Moon or Mars. And I think that Gateway has some real advantages to offer in terms of sustainability. Like if we were just to go back to the Moon for Artemis and go straight to the lunar surface and do a few missions and then call it a day, it's basically Apollo Redux. But if we actually have an asset in lunar orbit, we're going to keep going there. And so I think Gateway has some real benefits. The problem is again on messaging, because and Bridenstine has tried on this, but it's pretty easy to criticize Gateway, and I've certainly done it, to say that, well, if you're going to go all the way to lunar orbit, go to the surface of the Moon, because that's where all the action is. But I think from a sustainability standpoint, I've sort of come around to Gateway and think that it actually makes some sense to do that. And that likely will be the piece that survives. I would feel more confident about that if they hadn't ripped all the international components off Gateway, so that now it's just a U.S. only, two small modules, U.S. built. I think as soon as you bring international partnership into it, you stand a much better chance of survival. But of all the Artemis pieces, I would see Gateway as probably surviving, although OMB and Boeing are trying to kill it. So we'll see.
Okay, throw back to something you two said then. The NASA has a lot of really cool science missions, and they do a really bad job of making it understandable and making it known how much cool stuff is really going on. Unless you follow a handful of websites, you'll never find some of the stuff like this coming out of Parker Solar Probe or SDO or MMS or even Fermi or any of the really cool missions. It's even hard. I think MMS, I'll pick on that one. I think there's like 3 launch dates that are still on the NASA websites. I don't even think the correct launch date is out there. So, I mean, they've got to do a better job on making the stuff they're really doing appealing and valuable. And it is. There's a lot of cool stuff that's happened over the past 5 to 8 years.
So it's funny you say that. For the end of the decade, well, okay, if you want to get technical, it's not the end of the decade, but for the end of the 2010s, I sort of am doing a top 10 list of space stuff that's happened this decade, and you could make a list of 40 amazing things that have happened. I agree, there's a ton of stuff going on. I think it's not, NASA does try to promote that stuff. I'm not sure they do it in the most effective ways. But again, public has a limited appetite for this stuff, and they're more interested when people are involved. But I am the point of my speech was not to say that NASA is not doing cool stuff. It's done amazing things and continues to do amazing things. Certainly.
So I'll open maybe what's a darker topic, which is
Good.
do you see further militarization of space coming or inevitable? Is that something that you think is gonna drive space?
Well, that certainly is the concern. Since, I mean, China has obviously been interested in the militarization of space, and the Vice President Mike Pence has been very sort of explicit about how the U.S. wants space dominance in space. And the message of the Space Force to the world has been that the United States is looking to militarize space. And so, and that's how the Europeans have read it. A couple months ago, they came out and talked about their own plans to sort of have satellite defense, basically. France was leading this effort. So yeah, we're seeing it. I don't know that it can be stopped, especially when you look at the budgets of like the Air Force versus NASA. It's not even close. That's why I think preserving NASA as a civil space agency is super important, because like we need to have like civil activities in space. And I think the DoD would say, well, we're making space safe for civil space, and that may be true. But yeah, I worry a lot about the militarization of space, and unfortunately it seems inevitable. I don't know how to stop it.
Other questions?
Maybe to follow that, then, do you see civil more riding the coattails and taking advantage of dual purpose things? Technology's more like, I mean, it has often in the past, I think.
Do I see civil space sort of riding along on the investments made by I mean, yeah, I mean, I forget the exact thing, but like 4 or 5 years ago, the NRO basically revealed that it had built 2 Hubble-like telescopes and gave one of them to NASA because it didn't need them anymore, right? So I mean, yeah, we're going to get some benefit of that. I think the more powerful thing about NASA is that it sends a message to the world that, you know, this is space exploration for the pure exploration of space, you know, and the NASA brand is still very powerful around the world. I certainly would like to preserve that. I mean, like when, even today, when you look at our international partners, and, you know, we've jerked them around, right? We're going on a journey to Mars, and then we're going to build an international gateway with, like, the Russians were going to contribute an airlock, and the Europeans were going to build a hab module, and then, you know, and then we're going to the moon eventually, and it's going to be a big international coalition. And all of a sudden, it's first woman and next American to the moon. The gateway is all American, and the European contribution is the service module if they stop screwing around and you know, manage to build them on time. So it's been a much more jingoistic focus, and to their credit, like Japan is like, okay, you know, we'll join Artemis, and the Europeans at their ministerial were pretty supportive of Artemis. So like, you know, they're there. I don't want to, I wonder sort of how long we can continue down that path. Certainly they would rather work with America than China at this point.
Other questions?
You mentioned the new space being competitive. Do you ever see that being the dynamic? Where do you see that dynamic going in the future with new space and the relationship kind of with NASA and the collaboration?
You know, it's an interesting question because there's only one new space company that does not rely on NASA funding now. Okay, that's Blue Origin. They're independently funding. Every other company out there has a business plan that's based upon civil and national defense funding. SpaceX, about 60% of their missions today are commercial. They're not NASA or government, you know, funded. But even so, they're probably not making a lot of profit on those missions. The SpaceX was basically saved twice by the government, with COTS in 2006 and CRS in 2009. And so they are going to need, unless Starlink takes off, and maybe Starlink will. Like maybe that'll be I'm not super skeptical about Starlink. I think it's possible that that provides revenue in 5 years. But they need a lot of money to sort of fulfill their ambitions, and they're going to probably want to get that from NASA. So New Space, to some extent, is relying upon NASA sort of continuing to play along. And NASA has been a great partner to these companies, to CLIPS, and Bridenstine, to the extent he can, has been quite supportive. But the New Space companies, frankly, are better at operating streamlined than the big companies. Okay, I'll tell this one story. So a good source of mine is very familiar with the Commercial Crew Program, and he told me that after the 2014 awards were announced, when they gave the commercial crew contracts that we're still working on, he recalls going and visiting Boeing and said that the first thing Boeing did was, when they got the contract, was sort of get together in a room with the lawyers and figure out ways to get more money out of a fixed price contract. And he said when he went out to SpaceX, he couldn't get anyone, like, it was a bunch of grad students running around working on 6 different projects, and they couldn't get them to focus on Commercial Crew. And one of the real shames about that program is the fact that, neither company has really made Commercial Crew a priority, despite the public rhetoric. And that's really disappointing to me, because A, we've had this gap in human spaceflight, and B, why would you not want to be the company that launched humans back into space from the United States? So, it's a different way of thinking. And I could go on and on about this. I won't. It's 9 o'clock. But the new space companies have faster, leaner business models. They execute more quickly. But except for Blue Origin, they all have the same kind of funding concerns that the traditional companies have.
So one more question? Anybody? Okay. Thank you, Eric. It was great having you here.
Thank you very much.